Hello and welcome to another video in the series on health, disease and medicine. What we're going to be talking about in this video is a direct follow-on from the last video where we were talking about the human body's physical and chemical barriers to infection. We're going to talk a little bit about one example here of a group of infections called STIs, or sexually transmitted infections. So what we're essentially going to cover in this video a tiny little bit about the defenses that the reproductive system has and how the spread of STIs can actually be reduced. So first off, what defenses does the body actually have? Well, the defenses that are present are in the vaginal fluid, the vaginal fluid contains lysozymes, which, as we talked about last time round, lysozymes, as we talked about last time round, they can actually basically break down the cell walls of certain bacterial infections, and also within the female reproductive system there is mucus as well. Okay, and the mucus has the same kind of role of trapping those pathogens and helping them pass out of the body. Now, well, how do these conditions actually get passed from one another? Okay, so how are these transmitted? So the transmission comes through essentially what we call sexual fluids. What are sexual fluids? Well, we have vaginal fluids and we also have semen. So those are the two fluids that can be transferred between individuals that mean that these pathogens can go from one individual to another. So how do we sort of stop the spread of these conditions, and what kind of conditions are we actually talking about? So a couple of examples of sexually transmitted diseases include HIV, talked about in a previous video, okay, and also another one, chlamydia. Okay, there are a few others, but these are just two examples that we're going to talk about. So we've got HIV, which is a virus, and we've got chlamydia, which is caused by a bacteria. So we can stop the spread by using an artificial barrier. So for example, we have condoms. Okay, so what you'll notice is that here in the reproductive system there aren't necessarily those physical barriers that would usually protect us, like our skin. So we can basically introduce this artificial barrier, condoms, and that will stop the spread of almost all sexually transmitted infections. Okay, there's always a tiny little chance that those condoms could break or not be functioning properly, in which case there is a risk. However, it drastically lowers the risk of those sexually transmitted infections being passed from one another. Now, why is it that sexually transmitted infections are actually so difficult to stop the spread of? Well, most of the time, people who have sexually transmitted infections have no idea they're infected. Okay, many of them are sort of asymptomatic. They don't show many symptoms to start with, so they might not know they've actually got an infection. So many don't know they're actually infected. So how can we help with this? Well, luckily, one of the things that we have sort of developed is we've developed lots of chemical tests that through simple swabs or testing fluids, we can actually identify whether people have a sexually transmitted infection or not. This whole process is called screening. So what we can do is we can screen a population to identify the people that have sexually transmitted infections, let them know they have a sexually transmitted infection, and then it can be treated. So we can have some screening, which can then lead to treatment. And also advice. Another thing that's actually slightly dangerous about sexually transmitted infections is they can actually be passed from mother to the unborn child. Okay, because if the mother is infected with a sexually transmitted infection, it can essentially go from them into their unborn child. An example of this is HIV. So if the mother is HIV positive, the likelihood is that the child being born will also be HIV positive. So sexually transmitted infections is just one area where we can sort of show some of the examples of physical and chemical barriers, both natural and also artificial. So what we've talked about in this video, we've just talked very briefly about sexually transmitted infections. We've talked about the natural defences of the reproductive system, including vaginal fluid and the mucus. We've talked a little bit about how these infections are transmitted between individuals. So you've got sexual fluids, vaginal fluids and semen. We've talked about a couple of examples, HIV and chlamydia. And then we've gone on to talk about how we can stop the spread. So there's sort of two things that we can do there to help out. The first is, if you are engaging in sexual activity, is to use an artificial barrier such as a condom, because that prevents the exchange of sexual fluids, so therefore you cannot exchange the pathogens. And then also this idea of screening. So if we sort of have these screening initiatives whereby as many people as possible are screened for these sexually transmitted infections, we can identify who has these infections so that we can provide them with treatment but also advice. If you're affected by anything in this video, or you just want to do a little bit more research, there's a couple of links in the description below that you might find useful. So, thank you very much for watching this video. Next time around, we're going to talk a little bit about the immune system and the immune response. So, as always, thank you very much for watching, and I'll catch you in the next video.